If you were around in the late 70s through the 80s, or simply a fan of that era of music, one household name that stands out amongst the rest is the Cars. Combining rockabilly, new wave, pop rock, and power pop, the Cars would become a hugely influential band and would be at the forefront of new wave music. The Cars seemed to be one of the few bands at the time who united fans of different genres. But let's get the good times rolling from the actual beginning. Though they were formed in Boston, the initial pairing of frontman and rhythm guitarist Ric Ocasek and bassist vocalist Benjamin Orr began in 1968 in Cleveland, Ohio. Ocasek would be born in Baltimore to a Polish Catholic family. His father was a computer systems analyst working for NASA, and he would send his son to a religious elementary school where he wasn't exactly a good student, getting expelled by the 5th grade. Rick would even admit to Rolling Stone that he couldn't remember the exact reason he got expelled, other than he was a tough kid and rebellious. By the time he was a teenager, it was pretty common for him to spend weeks from home at the coastal town of Ocean City. It was by the time he was 16, his parents would relocate to Cleveland, and for a few short years, Rick became more studious, hoping to get into college. Rick also started to dabble in photography, developing photos in his parents' basement, and even got a broadcaster's license and started building radio transmitters. After high school, he attended several post-secondary institutions, including Bowling Green State University, but these schools couldn't really hold his attention. He also took a bigger interest in the lyrics of artists like Bob Dylan, Lou Reed, as well as Neil Young. He soon started writing his own songs and realized that he wanted to become a musician, recalling to Rolling Stone, "After I started writing songs, I figured it would be good to start a band. Sometimes I'd put together a band just to hear my songs. If a person couldn't play that well, there'd be fewer outside ideas to incorporate." Rick at the time was struggling to make ends meet, and he was working as a draftsman for the Ohio Bell Telephone when he put a band together called ID Nirvana in 1967. The band would include one of his coworkers, and they would do gigs around Columbus as well as Cleveland. Ocasek would soon meet the writing partner he had been looking for up until that point in his life, Benjamin Orr. They met at an office where they were both working for a booking agency, and Ocasek had actually seen Orr perform several years prior in 1965 when he was in the band The Grasshoppers, who played on a local TV program called The Big Five Show. Ocasek would recall to Magnum Magazine how their musical collaboration started. "I had a band in Columbus called ID Nirvana, very era appropriate, and he came to see us. He told me he could sing, came to my house, and sang the Beatles Yesterday in the sweetest voice I ever heard. The next day, he joined the band and every other band I had up to and through the Cars." Orr's foray into music was a little different than Ocasek's. He would keep his parents' attention when he was a young kid miming Elvis records. He dropped out of high school playing in the Cleveland music scene, and he'd be able to play all the instruments and got into songwriting and production, even fronting the house band on a local TV show called Upbeat, which saw groups like the Dave Clark Five and the Rolling Stones make appearances. When it came to ID Nirvana, it wasn't out of the norm for them to lie to club owners, telling them they'd only do top 40 covers, when in fact they would get on stage and play their own tunes. It would of course result in some tense moments. Ocasek would recall to Rolling Stone, "Once we got run out of town with guns, ID Nirvana would continue to play shows around Ohio and did in fact get some opportunities. They would open for the Bob Seger System as well as Alice Cooper." It was during this period Ocasek was paying the bills managing a clothing store called Family Britches, and he would hire Orr to work at the store as well. It was by 1970 though, the duo started a new band called Leatherwood and started working on material that was eerily reminiscent of Crosby, Stills and Nash. Ocasek and Orr would frequently travel from Ohio to New York, Woodstock, Ann Arbor, basically checking out any burgeoning music scenes before finally settling in Boston by 1971-1972. Boston presented a really good opportunity for the aspiring musicians, having a lot of colleges and places to play, so there would be no shortage of available gigs. Ocasek would actually reside in nearby Cambridge and even took in some lectures at Harvard just for the fun of it. Ocasek would be the first of the pair to move to Boston, as Orr didn't want to leave Ohio initially, as his father had recently passed and he wanted to make sure his mother was okay. Ocasek would constantly call Orr for the next 6 months or so before he finally moved to the city. It was in Cambridge they formed the folk rock trio Milkwood, who would put out a lone record in 1972 called How's the Weather on Paramount Records. But it quickly went nowhere. But the band did get two valuable things out of that experience. They learned not to abruptly accept business deals, and number two, they met future Cars keyboardist Greg Hawkes, who was a session musician at the time. Ocasek would tell Rolling Stone that Hawkes was just the keyboard player he was looking for, and while his playing was simple, he was also open to experimenting. Ocasek and Orr would play through a few more bands, and it seemed like with each new band, they were slowly inching towards developing the right formula. In 1976, they formed the band Cap'n Swing, which was similar to Steely Dan. That group would be made up of four future members of the Cars: Orr, Ocasek, Hawkes, and guitarist Elliot Easton. In fact, Easton, a left-handed guitarist, was a graduate from the prestigious Berklee School of Music in Boston and had both concise and melodic playing that contributed greatly to the band's sound. They would develop a small following around Boston, and it would be a local DJ, Maxine Sartori, who was famous for helping get groups like Aerosmith and Billy Squier their first record deal. Sartori saw Cap'n Swing at a club, she got their demo tape and started playing their music on her show on WBCN. At that time, WBCN was one of the biggest rock stations in the country, and you have to remember this was the 70s when DJs had a lot more freedom to play what they wanted. The band soon did a showcase for record executives in New York at Max's Kansas City, but things didn't go well. In fact, they were told that their sound and image was, and I quote, all over the place. It was another lesson for the band. Ocasek decided that they needed to shed some of their band members, so they downsized to himself, of course, Orr, Hawkes, and Easton. Ben Orr, who had played the role of frontman without a bass in his hand on stage for Cap'n Swing, would split vocal duties with Rick and go back to playing bass. Rick also wanted to write songs with tighter structures and ditch the long extended jam sessions. That DJ friend of theirs, Sartori, who played Cap'n Swing's demo, would recommend local native David Robinson, who really was the only member of the Cars lineup that had experience playing in a nationally known band, the Modern Lovers. Robinson at the time was playing in the group DMZ, and Ocasek had seen Robinson play when he first got to Boston. For the veteran drummer, this new band was going to be his last. Fast forward to the fall of 1976 in Ocasek's basement in Newton, Mass. His new band are sowing the seeds for one of the greatest rock records of all time. Easton would tell Rolling Stone, "It was beautiful to put that first bunch of songs together. It was the first time it was so easy in any band I'd been in. We knew what we wanted to stick out. The way it worked was it would be either on the cassette or Rick would pick up his guitar and perform the song for us. We'd all watch his hands and listen to the lyrics and talk about it. We knew enough about music, so we just built the songs up. When there was a space for a hook or a line or sinker, we put it in." They made an agreement with each other, though, that after the basement sessions, record label deal or not, they were going to record these songs and release them. Now they just needed a name. The band would come up with a list of 10 names and headed to Boston University and surveyed random students on Commonwealth Avenue. It was their drummer Robinson who initially had the idea for the moniker The Cars, but Ocasek wasn't convinced it was a winner just yet. They'd frequently be met with answers from students like, "I don't care to answer that," or "I don't like any of them." They'd eventually settle on The Cars, with Ocasek telling the interviewer, "It was David, our drummer's idea. A car, it's like one of the American staples. You can jump into the car and roll up the windows and turn on the air conditioning for climate control and drive through the environment while you listen to the music completely in your own privacy. It was like a pop art conception, like 20 Campbell soup cans." Another important part of the Cars was the visual component. Robinson, a former art student, was instrumental in coming up with the band's persona, their appearance, their logo, as well as their stage setup. Robinson came up with the black, white, and red color scheme since a lot of the members had black and white clothing. It would be widely reported that the Cars' first official gig took place at an Air Force base on New Year's Eve of 1976, but in reality, that was their second gig. According to the book Let's Go, Benjamin Orr and the Cars, the band's first gig was a few days prior at a motel lounge somewhere along Route 9 just outside of Boston. Robinson would refer to that first show as an experimental gig, while keyboardist Greg Hawkes wouldn't play the first two shows since he wasn't yet an official member. It was by February of 77, the Cars were playing shows at the Rat, the Paradise Rock Club, and soon buzz was building around the band in local papers. They would be frequently labeled early on as punk because punk groups were mostly playing the Rat, and it was also around this time the band would travel to New York City to play CBGB. By April of 1977, the Cars would hit the studio to record 12 tracks, including the song Just What I Needed, which would end up changing the band's fortunes. The owner of the studio where the Cars recorded these demos would have his office wainscoted and painted by Rick and Ben, in addition to their manager. As part of the agreement to help the studio owner's office, the Cars in return got some studio time. It was after 3 months of playing gigs at school dances and clubs, the Cars would sign a management deal with a guy named Fred Lewis, who was the ex-manager for fellow Boston rockers J. Geils Band. Ocasek would be adamant that the last decade of struggling had prepared all of the members for how to handle the business side of the music industry. They now knew how to hire a good manager, they knew what a good record deal looked like, and Lewis, who had previously worked at Atlantic Records as their New England promotion man, would be instrumental in getting the band connected to the right people. Ocasek would remark, 2 weeks after we signed with Fred, we were a last-minute addition to a Bob Seger show produced by Don Law, who is a prominent New England promoter. Remember that radio DJ Sartori, who I previously mentioned? Well, she, along with a few other radio DJs, started playing Just What I Needed, and by the summer of 77, Just What I Needed became the most requested track on local Boston radio. The band's demo tape would also win a local Super Bowl Battle of the Bands contest. Even without a record label deal, the Cars were quickly being compared to other Boston rock royalty like Aerosmith, J. Geils Band, and Boston. These radio stations who were playing the Cars started reporting their songs on local trade publications, and that was enough to attract the attention of both Arista Recordings and Elektra Records. The Cars would end up signing with Elektra, considering it to be an easier place to stand out as a new wave act, plus they gave the band more creative control. But the folks at Elektra had concerns about the quality of the group's demo, so they enlisted famed Queen producer Roy Thomas Baker. Baker would recall, the songs were basically there, they just needed to be rearranged slightly. A chorus put in here, a verse taken out there, and the speed needed to be adjusted, but apart from that, they were already excellent. It may be a surprise to some of you that it wasn't Baker's work with Queen that impressed the Cars, but rather his work with the Zombies and Free. Elektra had budgeted for 6 weeks in the studio to record the Cars' debut album, but the band would complete the recordings in just 12 days and mixed it in just another week. With the exception of Moving in Stereo, all the tracks would be written by Rick and Ben, who would also share vocal duties with one another. The iconic cover would feature Russian model and musician Natalia Medvedeva at the wheel of a car that probably looks like something that would emerge if you put the words cringe and beautiful into an AI art generator. The artwork was not the band's idea, instead coming solely from Elektra. More than one member of the Cars have since expressed disappointment in the choice. They preferred to go with drummer David Robinson's black and white photo series that only cost them $80 to produce. Elektra would release the first single, Just What I Needed, a week before the album came out in late May of 1978. The song would peak at number 27 on the Hot 100 chart. Some in certain media circles noted that the disc was extremely British sounding with its bright timbres and judicious use of production techniques like phasing and echo. They would mostly chalk that up to Roy Thomas Baker's production style. There were also grumblings in the press blaming Roy Thomas Baker for neutering the band to make them more commercially digestible. Ocasek would tell the LA Times, "We had the arrangements ready before we went to the studio. We didn't compromise our sound. We think the music sounds fresh." It took time for the album to make inroads in areas outside of the Northeast. The second single, My Best Friend's Girl, was also successful, peaking at number 35 on the singles chart. While the title may suggest the song is autobiographical, it's not. It was an image that Ocasek conjured up himself. The following year, Good Times Roll would peak at number 41, and by the end of 1978, the Cars sold an impressive 1 million copies of their debut record, making it one of the strongest debuts of the year. The Cars' debut record would end up going platinum 6 times, with it peaking at number 18 on the album charts.